Welcome, everybody. My name is Allison Arnold. I'm the extension agent here in Buncombe County, and I'll be your host today. Welcome to Gardening in the Mountains, Beyond Hosta's Colorful Shade Gardens. I'd like to welcome our speaker today, Deb Breck. Deb moved to Asheville in 2008 from Connecticut, and from a flat 1 acre full sun property to 1 acre of dry forest on a slope. She is a Buncombe County Extension Master Gardener volunteer, and gardening is her passion. Her interest in shade gardening, however, was born of necessity. In the last 15 years, she's been drawing inspiration from naturally occurring plant communities, working to remove and replace invasive plants, and learning by experience how to create magnificent gardens in our Western North Carolina dry shade. We're excited to learn from Deb today that there is more to grow in the shade than hostas. So take it away, Deb.
Thank you, Allison, and good morning, everyone. I'm so pleased to welcome you to our discussion about shade gardening. As Allison mentioned, I have become a shade gardener not by choice necessarily, but by circumstance. I now live in a shady woodland on a slope, and it's been quite a shift in perspective and an education to me about the beauty of shade. I'm going to share some of my experiences with you today and hope my trials and errors will help you become a successful shade gardener. Let's talk about what some of the elements that I've experienced have helped me succeed, and the advantages of shade gardening, also the inconveniences of shade gardens, assessing the shade conditions in your garden, and beyond sunlight, some of the general gardening issues that every gardener faces regardless of their particular environment, pests and disease control in the shade, and the most fun, really, the design elements of shade gardens. Some of the advantages of shade gardening, and there are many, and these are things that I didn't come to appreciate until I started this experience. One thing, if you don't have a lot of sun, the foliage doesn't burn. The flower colors are really more intense in the shade garden than you might think. With sun, even though you can grow very colorful plants, they do get washed out by the bright light. In the shade garden, I would say they rather glow by whatever light they can find. The flowers often last longer because of the shady, moist, probably cooler conditions. Many of the plants are more drought tolerant than full sun plants. They require less fertilizer typically. The weeds are more manageable because everything grows more slowly. There are typically fewer insect problems, less routine maintenance because your weeding is low and your growth rate is typically low. There really is a range of interesting, perhaps more unique plants than some sun options. Many garden styles, for example, Asian style gardens, look best in shady zones. Of course, it's not all good news. There are some inconveniences of shade that we have to cope with. There may be fewer plant choices, especially flowering plants. Plants grow more slowly. That's kind of the good news and the bad news. It does require that you either develop more patience or that you plant more plants. You plant more densely when you're creating the garden in order to fill the spaces faster. So that may be a little more costly. IFOs impact the appearance. These are identifiable falling objects such as pine needles, leaves, pine cones, various sheddings of the overstory plants. If you're looking for an absolutely pristine garden without a speck of debris in it, this is not a shade garden typically. One of the few pests that we do find are slugs and snails, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail. You may have more potential for disease due to the moist conditions. Finally, if you're looking for a lawn, this is not the place to try to grow a lawn. So you may need to rethink that. Number one enemy of shade gardening really is root competition. People often think that it's the lack of sunlight that creates the challenges, but it's really typically the root competition from the trees and shrubs that are creating the shade. They are the big kids on the block. Whatever rainfall or plants come down through the overstory, they're going to get first crack at it. Their roots are much bigger, more comprehensive systems. So they're going to take whatever resources are available from the smaller plants they're competing with. Allison, any questions at this point?
Deb, just some reminders there. People are interested in native plants, certainly
Okay.
this year resistance.
Okay. I'm glad to have the awareness of native plants. That's also become a focus. And one of the things, just as an overview, we'll get to more specifics later, that I've tried to do is when I have an opportunity to plant something new in my garden or replace an invasive that I've yanked out, I try to replace it with native plants. We are going to talk more about those things later. But before we get there, I think it's really important to understand what we are dealing with. We want to talk about what is shade and what it is not, because assessing your particular shady conditions is really the essential key to succeeding in your garden. It's not a static concept. I think that was something that I didn't understand when I first started. It's something that changes over time, over the seasons, over the course of a day. You've got to really study it before you plan your garden. We do know that something less than full sun, and as I mentioned, it changes over time and from season to season. And it's really an empirical measure of the conditions on your particular site. Some of the questions you need to ask yourself are, how much sunlight does your garden receive? We'll talk about how to measure that in a moment. When do you get light? Between what hours of the day is your garden the sunniest or the shadiest? Is the light direct or indirect? How much does the quantity and quality of light change through the seasons? What is the orientation of your garden? Are you getting morning light and afternoon shade, which is really the ideal conditions? Or are you, like my garden, getting morning shade and afternoon sun, which can be more challenging? How do we approach this? How do we figure out what the heck is going on? First, you want to identify the sources of your shade. What causes your garden to be shady? Is it a building or wall or other structure that's creating the shade? Tall trees? Are they deciduous or evergreen? Will it be shady all year or only when the trees above are fully leafed out? And what is the nature of your shade? So sources and nature of your shade, that's what you need to assess. There are many shade classifications. I found during my research for this program, probably at least a half a dozen. They were all slightly different. I chose two because I think the first one is one that you will see most typically in garden catalogs. It's even somewhat similar to the definitions on the NC State website. Let's go with those just so we know what we're dealing with. Often full sun is defined as direct sun for much of the day, so 6 or more hours. That is a direct full sun garden. Partial sun or partial shade, depending on which way you want to look at it, is shade much of the day, but with some sunlight or lots of filtered light. And full shade is shade almost all the time. Shade plants will thrive, and partial shade plants do not. An alternate shade assessment that I think is more helpful for me is really talking about the shade itself, not sun versus shade, but the shade itself, the nature of the shade. Partial shade is at least a few hours of direct sun each day. As I mentioned before, morning sun, afternoon shade, or vice versa. Light shade is distinguished by the quality of the light. Dappled sunlight, for example, this is my situation in some parts of the garden, deciduous trees with high canopy or small leaves site on the north side of a slope where the light is really reflected into the garden. Full shade is shaded throughout the gardening season. So that would be evergreens. We have a hemlock canopy that we deal with every north-facing garden. You're really not getting much light at all. Dense shade is really everything under mature evergreens, very low branching, You're just not getting much of any bright light at all. In addition, the shade varies by various conditions. The orientation of your garden relative to the position of the sun, the season of the year, and the time of day. One of the interesting tests that I found, this is more practical than the theoretical, I think, is to plant a petunia. Now, I don't know if this has any scientific basis, but this was offered as an option, so you might want to try that. If it does okay, you're in partial shade. If it dies, you're in full shade. You have full shade conditions. If it thrives and flowers, you've got a full sun garden. Any questions about that?
I love the Petunia Test. I hadn't seen that before.
Well, I didn't even try it because I know I can't grow a petunia in my yard. So if you know that, you've already solved the problem. But if you have different conditions, or you might want to try it in different places in your yard because it's going to have different conditions there. So it may be helpful to some folks.
We have one question about shade from a building that
Yes.
varies a lot through the season as the sun shifts from north to south, and asking if you have any suggestions about that.
Well, you're stuck with it. First of all, there's not much you can do. If it's in woodland, you might be able to raise the canopy to create some new shade. I think you'll be mostly dependent on your plant selections in that particular space. We're going to talk a lot about plants, different options, and how they change through the season, depending upon where that building sits relative to your garden and the angle of the sun throughout the seasons. You may be able to plant things in certain seasons that need more sun than other seasons. You might really have a lot of options. When we think of shade, the seasonal changes in light and light conditions, and to some degree, moisture conditions, can give us a lot of variability that may not be obvious. It certainly wasn't obvious to me when I started down this road. Just in the spirit of making sure that everyone's aware of these other issues as well, just as you would with any garden and a shade garden as well, you need to be conscious of the health of your soil. You need to make sure that there's sufficient moisture for your plant material, that you have good air circulation. This may be particularly important in shade gardens because they do tend to stay more moist than other gardens. And so they can be places where diseases can thrive. So you want to make sure that your plants aren't too close together and that everything has plenty of room to move and it gets plenty of air. Regular maintenance, of course, is critical to any garden. But as I mentioned before, the maintenance in the shade garden can be much reduced to full sun situations. That can be a very relaxing and less stressful gardening experience than some. We do have some issues with pest and disease control in the shade garden. As I mentioned before, there are typically fewer pests in terms of insects. The exception would be slugs and snails, because of course they love the conditions of soft soil and moist conditions and the dark conditions. I have not had that experience in my garden as much because I have some very mature American hollies that shed their leaves from time to time. As I've learned when I've been in my garden maintaining it and trying to sit down to do some weeding or planting, those are very sharp leaves, especially when they're dried. They seem to be controlling the slugs and snails. If you have issues with that, you might try some remedies that will repel them or make it uncomfortable for them to live there. I do have a pretty extensive one-page handout on pest and disease controls, identifying each probable pest, identifying each disease, and suggesting some controls for those issues. Let's move on to the fun part, the design elements of a shade garden. I'm going to start with color because I think shade gardens aren't always appreciated because people think everything is green or brown or not very interesting. And I hope that I will convince you otherwise by the end of this program. Color is a consideration when you're planning or designing your garden, as it would be in any garden. What makes the color very interesting as opposed to a full sun garden is the light and shadow and the way that plays on the plants throughout the day and really changes the way they look. It can be very dramatic and beautiful. So that's something to keep in mind. Again, that goes back to your shade assessment. Where's the light coming from? How is it moving across the garden? Depending upon the season and the time of the day. As in many other gardens, you want to layer different forms and textures and heights and contrasting and complementary colors, textures to make your garden interesting. The goal is for everything to work together to create year-round interest in your garden. Let's continue on with the color and greens. Sometimes I think there's a thought that green is just a little bit boring, but I think if you look closer, there are so many plants now that occur naturally and also have been bred with variegated foliage. It can be speckled, marbled, striped, margins with various colors, overlaid with silver. There really are a lot of options to make the greens and the shade pop with these bright contrasting colors. I think it's also important when you're designing a garden to think about things that are going to unify all the different elements and all the different individual plants. Gray can be a great color for that, or a pale silver. It can bring cohesiveness to the design. If you're designing for a woodland garden or in that imitation of nature, which is the way I learned to garden, is that the gray and brown bark can add earth tones, which are a nice contrast to the bright greens and yellows that you might choose. You also want to think about the interplay, as I said before, of light and shadow and the impact on the placement of your plants when you're planting the garden. Light colored plants and foliage, light blue, yellows, pale greens, the variegated foliage, they'll appear more prominent. They will, to your eye, come forward in the garden, whereas the dark colors tend to recede. The exception to that is red. I'll show you a couple of examples of that later on. In addition to selecting plants for the seasons, there are many plants that have year-round interest in a shade garden. For example, for greens, you have trees and shrubs and ferns. I love choosing trees or shrubs with interesting bark because even in the winter, if you don't have anything in bloom or much else going on, it's just fascinating to see some of the beautiful bark creations that happen. I've given you some examples here. I will admit that my very favorite is witch hazel. I just think it's an amazing plant. It's a full 4-season plant. It's a small tree, can be used in a lot of different contexts, and there's always something going on at all times of the year. So let's talk about the seasons and some of your plant options, because there are 4-season opportunities for shade gardens. In the winter, you could think about blooming bulbs, galanthus, snowdrops, and hellebores, winter aconite. These all are blooming in the wintertime. These pictures were taken in January. My hellebores took a real hit this year with the severe conditions over the Christmas holidays, and I thought they were gone, but clearly they're not. They're just a little bit late this year, but those are great options. And another option that I really like, but I don't have a picture of it because it did die as a result of the conditions, is Himalayan sweetbox. It's on one of the plant lists that we'll be distributing. You'll see that. It's an evergreen, low-growing evergreen shrub. It blooms in February. It's very fragrant. Just really, really worth looking at if you have the right spot to put them. Spring is really when a shade garden can shine, and you can have so many options for plantings, typically because if you have deciduous trees that create shade for summer, they are not leafed out in the spring, and you can grow many, many things. These daffodils all came from my yard. They were grown and blooming in a place where I couldn't plant anything that required even partial shade in the high summer, but there's plenty of light in the spring. So I think planning for a spring shade garden, especially when it's right after the winter time and everybody's dying to get out, and you get out and there's all these beautiful things blooming. It's just a really wonderful time in the shade garden. Have a demonstration of some jonquils, all kinds of bulbs that can bloom in the spring, some calycanthus, which is a lovely shrub, bleeding heart, of course, and rhododendrons. Solomon seal, here's an example of how that red can pop out. These are planted in front of some red azaleas, but in fact, that red creates a great foil for the Solomon seal. One of my favorites, and this is for all the native folks, Trillium. Just a little story about my garden. When we bought the property, there was about a 2-foot depth of English ivy that had grown over the last 80 years since the house had been built. We, at this point, have removed probably 2/3 of it. You rip up the ivy and then you're like, oh, now what's going to happen? I see weeds coming that I didn't have to deal with before. But what else came were all these woodland flowers and plants that I did not plant. It's as if it gave them an opportunity to find a spot. Now they're in my garden, and the trillium have been multiplying like crazy. If you clear the place, they will come. And trilliums are just such a delight in the spring. So that's one of my favorites as well. Now on to summer. The sun is getting hotter. The shade is full, and your conditions have completely changed in the garden. One of my favorites, again, is St. John's wort. The form that I have is a shrub, and it's a bee magnet. It's in pretty much full shade. Those bright yellow flowers just pop and create a big bright spot in the garden, and the bees are on it 24/7. It seems every time I go out, it's covered. This form, as I've indicated, is also medicinal, can be used for medicinal purposes. I make a wonderful infused oil that's a great pain reliever. If you're inclined to do that, you get double duty out of this. Mosses are another one of my favorite plant materials, bryophytes. This is a stone wall and a stone staircase on my property. Again, these just came on their own. I didn't do anything except try to keep the weeds away. Someone planted some sedum a long time ago, and I'm still trying to get it out without destroying all the moss. There are probably on this particular slide at least 6 different species of moss. I think it's just a wonderful, soothing thing to look at and enjoy in your shade garden if you have the right conditions. So here we are on full summer. This is a shot of one of my gardens. It's maybe a little bit difficult to see, but you can see there's oak leaf hydrangea in the background. There's carex. Those are native grasses that are along the edge of the wall. The crested iris are not blooming anymore, but their foliage remains. So they have that nice spiky dark green effect. There are probably at least 8 different species of ferns on this hillside now. And those are obviously wonderful shade plants. The bright pop of red on the left side is Spigelia marilandica, or Indian pink, and they are just thriving and present a wonderful color option for your shade garden. Here's some things that bloom in the fall as well. This panicum is something that I chose to deal with a very steep slope situation, which is in the shade. As many of you may know, it's very challenging to find grasses that will grow in the shade, at least the ones that you want. So I found this to be a wonderful solution for that. I've had much less erosion, and it's a very tall plant, can be used for screening in the fall. It throws up these beautiful small white blossoms when they're all together. I happen to have 50 plants on that slope. It's quite dramatic and quite beautiful, and they take absolutely no maintenance. Japanese anemone, probably many of you have in your garden. That's a wonderful shade plant, something popping in the fall. And then, of course, not to forget about trees. Japanese maples tend to be very successful in the shade. If you have room for them, there are literally hundreds of varieties, sizes, colors of leaves, shapes of leaves. So that's something to be considered in your options. Any more questions, Allison?
Yeah, we had a couple. And I was thinking about this because I have a huge beech tree and all the flowers have just fallen all over the garden in the last few days with this dry wind. But somebody also says they have a big oak tree and the catkins have dropped. And wondering, do you remove those, the things that are coming out of trees, or do you just mulch them under? Or how do you work with those things?
For me personally, it depends on the volume, I would say. As I mentioned, I have those holly trees and they do shed quite a bit. And there's a lot of other deciduous material that sheds. On a slope, a lot of what I've experienced is a lot of it's rolling down to the bottom where it's a little easier to get to. I do selective cleanup in the shade garden from time to time, probably a couple times a year. Now I'm cleaning it up for the summer season, and then I might do a little more cleanup in the fall after the trees have shed. I have a tool that I use that is a combination blower and mulcher machine. Actually can gently vacuum. I can't believe I'm vacuuming my yard, but I am. I can gently vacuum these materials up and they go through the mulcher in the machine. And then I bag that and then I go out and spread it back in the garden for mulch because for me, it just looks tidier. It's already half broken down. So it makes it easier for it to supplement the soil. I just rake it into a big pile and chop it all up and then mulch it back up there when I can. I think it's really an aesthetic view of your own garden. Mine is pretty relaxed. I love the woodland look. I don't mess with it too much. I don't haul it away. I leave everything, put everything back where it was, but it might look a little bit more like a tidier mulch.
I have a couple more, but just for now, so we can move on a little bit. Are other grasses or sedges or things like that for shade that you can recommend?
There are some, it's just on that one slide. I can go back. Right down here, this is some carex. I have several kinds of native grasses here. They are short, they're not tall ones. I chose them because this is a stone wall here. So I wanted them really to edge the stone wall. But yes, there are a number, not as many options as full sun grasses, but there are, and they're native. Carex is one class. The switchgrass will tolerate some shade. That's the panicum that I showed you. This is a form of switchgrass. There are lots of forms of switchgrass. I needed something really tall, but there are other ones that I've planted. I'm trying to remember the name of the cultivar. It usually has fire in the cultivar name, and they are multicolored grasses. They will tolerate some shade. Now, they're not full shade plants or deep shade plants, but they will tolerate some shade. There's some sedges that I've also looked at that are very low growing. They're very long leaved, but they spread maybe a foot in full spread. They're nice just for some kind of cover. That's what you're looking
Okay, great. I'll hold these others for a little bit later.
for. Okay, I think we're almost done. I just wanted to give you a preview of the resources that we've assembled for you. I prepared some plant lists, and I'm hoping it will help for different seasons. Winter, spring, summer, fall. There's a page for each season and some plants that I either have in my garden or have some experience with that are very nice choices for shade gardens. There are two handouts that deal with the pest control and disease control for the plants. And then also a bibliography if you're a reader or if you still read books, if anybody still reads books. I have a lot of gardening books on that list. One of my favorite resources you will see is the North Carolina Extension Master Gardener website plant toolbox. If you're looking for plants, you can go to that site and it's almost like shopping for clothes. You can enter the conditions, the size of the plant, if you want a native, color, the blossoms, whatever your criteria are, that will pull up plants for you to suggest. It's very thorough. There's almost 5,000 plants in their catalog, and they're all plants that grow in North Carolina. I highly recommend that resource if you're not familiar with it. If you're looking for plants, I have to pitch the Buncombe County Master Gardener's annual plant sale, which will take place May 6th of this year. You can get more information about the location, the time, and so forth on our website. All the plants are contributed by master gardeners and members of the Blue Ridge Rose Society and the Men's Garden Club of Asheville. There will be people there that can answer your questions, help you with plant selection. That's a great opportunity that you have coming up if you're plant shopping. I hope that we'll do some more questions at this point, Allison, if you like.
Thank you so much, Deb. This has been really wonderful and comprehensive. Earlier on, you were talking about root competition, and I've got a couple of questions. One is there's been concern about cutting through roots of mature trees and understory shrubs. How do you work around the roots? And do we need to be concerned about planting plants that are shallow rooted? How do we work together with that?
What I've done, and you're more well versed with this than I am, so please jump in. If I want to put a plant someplace and I find that I'm putting it where there's a big root that seems to be a big source for one of the mature trees, and most of the trees on my property are quite mature, I just redesign a little bit, try to move it elsewhere, try to do as little damage as possible. I think if you are planting new plant material in there, a shallow rooted plant may well have a better chance of surviving because it will be able at least to get that surface water whenever it does come. In the drought, I still do water my shade garden once in a while. Well, years that I've been here, we have been in drought conditions. And so they have required a little more attention than other years where we have more typical rainfall seasons. In those years, I never water at all. That's how I've handled the roots situation because my trees are so valuable to me and they're so old and beautiful. I certainly don't want to do anything that might damage them.
Great advice. Just move plants over, respect the root, and adjust your design a little bit. I think that's helpful. It's good to go with perennials around large root trees or just mulch, but just so that you plant them, you leave them alone after that. Minimal disturbance is really important. Do you ever use containers in the shade garden?
Yes, I do, because I think that's a great way to pop in some color, some annual color. I tend to not have a lot of annuals, but being a plant addict, I will confess to having way too many house plants. In the summertime, I put them all outside and give them some nice fresh air and a change of scenery. I can't put them out in any place in my yard where there's too much sun because they would get burned out. So I intersperse them often in the shade garden. I find that mine really thrives in being outside for most of the summer. That's something that I've done with pots integrated in the shade garden. It's fun because then you can change the look and add some new design elements that weren't there before.
Yeah, absolutely. Bring in some color as well. What about ground covers? There's been a couple of comments. One was Allegheny spurge. What's your favorite ground cover?
My favorite. I've got a couple. Can I pick more than one?
Sure, absolutely.
One that I've had good success with that is a native. And Allison, I don't remember the botanical name, but it's called green and gold.
Oh, chrysanthemum.
So that's got a beautiful little yellow flower. And it seems to be really thriving where I've put it. It grows pretty fast relative to shade garden plants. That's one that I use. There's another one that's a non-native, and that's called sweet woodruff. I planted that on my slope because I was really looking for something to grow quickly. And it has a beautiful white fragrant flower in the spring or early summer. Some people I understand have had issues with it becoming maybe too vigorous, but it was a plant I knew from the Northeast where it was very well behaved, as some of those plants are in those conditions. I have not experienced or felt that it was growing anywhere that I didn't want it to grow. I have not had to control it, but I intended it for a large space on a slope just to hold the soil. Those are my two favorites, I would say. When I was doing the research for this, I saw suggestions for ajuga. Please do not plant that. You will rue the day. That's just a little warning. Try to go native if you can.
I'll just say this about ajuga. I planted one little pot in my garden and it has stayed there. But what it's done is it's gone out into the lawn. And right now it's quite gorgeous. It's flowering, but it's escaped. Not really anywhere else around the house, but it's further out and some fields and stuff that I have. So, yeah, that's been terrible. When we think of ground covers, we usually think of things that are very low growing, maybe 3 to 4 inches, like they're really covering the ground. But a lot of the plants that you've spoken about, or even like in this photo, the ferns and grasses and sedges will cover the ground. They might be 16 to 18 inches tall. A lot of it depends on your design and your location and what you're trying to do.
That's a great point. I'd always thought of ground covers as very low growing plants initially.
Yeah.
And I agree. You had mentioned Allegheny spurge. I have some of that and I really like it. It has to do a lot with your conditions, what kind of shade you have, what the plants are going to need in terms of conditions and your design. So I would say that's what drives plant selection.
What about wet shade? Areas that are either perpetually wet or periodically wet. What kind of plant selection should we be considering?
Well, ferns, they'll grow almost anywhere. They grow red shade, dry shade. At least that's been my experience on my property. I have them in both locations, and I've never lost a fern. There are so many varieties now, and there are many beautiful native varieties. In fact, going back to the ground cover question, I actually use the common name is hay-scented fern. It's not a nice tidy fern that stays in one place. It spreads by rhizome. If you want to fill in a spot in the shade, it will take some sun as well. It gets in my yard a bit of sun, maybe an hour a day in high summer, something like that. It tolerates that very well. And it spreads and it's not terribly high and it's bright. It's a bright green. So it's a beautiful contrast to the deep shade. That's what I've been using. I don't have real wet conditions in my yard, so I'm just not familiar, but there certainly are plants that are on the plant lists that I prepared that will have some wet shade options. Again, if you go to the North Carolina Extension Master Garden Plant Toolbox, you can put in that option and it will pull up some ideas for you.
I'm glad you mentioned the toolbox. It's got an excellent set of filters.
It's just fantastic. The more I use it, the more I like it.
It's a work in progress, so it's getting better and better as we continue to work on it. I would also recommend any material or literature from the Southeast, especially North Carolina, on wetland, stormwater, rain gardens specifically. They'll have good plant lists for plants that are either marginal or tolerant of submersion, that kind of stuff. A lot of it depends on what kind of moisture we're talking about. What about Iris cristata? Have you ever used that or seen that? The dwarf?
Oh, yes. I love that. That's one of my favorite plants. In fact, in the picture of my shade garden, the one section of it, you can't see it because the bloom period was over, but mine's just starting to break now. That's another ground cover, if you will. That's an option. Again, it's on a slope. And I planted, I think, maybe 6 bulbs a few years ago. I would say I now have a patch that's easily 10 by 10, and it just covers that slope. And when they're all in bloom, it's just absolutely gorgeous. So I would highly recommend that if that plant works for you in your situation.
Just in the few minutes we have left, when you were talking about your garden and getting rid of the ivy, could you just tell us your personal story on how you thought about that?
My personal nightmare? That's the process that you're talking about. Well, we'd first cut it down to the ground as far as possible. Worked in sections. We cut it down to the ground and then let a little bit of it resprout. Get some new fresh leaves because it was very, very old ivy. and it's very leathery leaves. We cut it all down, we let it rebloom, if you will, release out. At that point, with the new tender leaves, we did 2 applications of an OMRI certified herbicide. The one that I used, and I still use it, is called Avenger. It's really just a citrus oil, and it basically just burns the plant and deprives it of oxygen and water. That didn't work. So then we let it release, and then when the leaves were young and tender, we did an application of Roundup, and that helped kill the plant. But what we ultimately did was we just removed all the vine. We pulled out by hand all the other vine that we could get to. It's still coming up. It still pops up in my yard. I don't think, though, it's from what was there. I think it's from the berries that come from the vertical English ivy, where people don't keep it off their trees. Because, as you may know, English ivy actually changes its genetic structure when it goes from growing on the ground to growing up trees. At that point, when it's vertical, it blooms and creates berries. And of course, the birds love the berries, and they fall and they get eaten by the birds, and then they get spread around. If you have English ivy, at least take it off your trees so that it doesn't get worse. But yeah, it took us months to do that. The good news was that from all that old growth ivy, the soil, it had broken off the clay. When we first came here, and I was used to the loam of the Northeast, and you dig a hole and put a plant in it, it would grow. That didn't work when we came here and we hit soil, and my husband was using a mattock to dig a hole in the clay. So good news about ivy, and if you pull it up, you'll probably have some nice loamy soil to deal with.
Well, we're generating a lot of interest, and you've given a lot of inspiration and some great ideas. I'm on a north-facing slope, and I have large mature trees, so I've got my plant list, and I'm ready to go.
Well, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed doing this, and I really appreciate everyone's time and attention to be with us this morning. I hope that everyone can leave with some ideas for their shade garden plans. Something that I've learned over the years, instead of just feeling like I was coping with shade, I really have learned to celebrate shade and all the beauty of the plants. There's nothing more cooling on a hot summer day than to go out and be in my shade garden. And so I hope you will learn to celebrate it and really enjoy that experience. Thank you for having me.
Beautiful. Thank you, Deb. We want to thank you for attending. Next month, May 18th, we've got Planting on Steep Slopes. That registration link will be available soon. Also, go to buncombeMasterGardener.org for our upcoming events. And we look forward to seeing you soon in the garden or here online. And so appreciate everybody for coming today. Thank you so much.